When you're no longer available to an avoidant, something profound shifts, not just in the dynamic, but in their internal operating system. You have to understand avoidants function from a framework of emotional safety through distance. Their sense of control doesn't come from closeness. It comes from regulation, from managing your access to them. They feel powerful when they can decide when to engage and when to disappear. But here's the catch. That illusion of control only works as long as you're still available on some level. The second you remove yourself from that equation, fully, completely, without apology, you break the game they've been subconsciously playing all along. See, they counted on your emotional availability like a hidden safety rope. Even when they pulled away, deep down they expected you'd still be there. That you'd text again, that you'd keep the door open, that you'd wait patiently while they processed their fears or danced with their emotional detachment. But the moment you disappear, when your presence, your emotional labor, your effort is no longer on the table, they don't just notice, they panic. Not always outwardly, but psychologically, something unravels because it was never just about you. It was about the system they had built their identity around. The avoidant doesn't chase closeness, they manage it. They rely on their ability to control how much emotion they receive, when, and from whom. And when you're no longer available, that system is compromised. Their perceived dominance over the emotional tone of the relationship vanishes. Now they're the one watching, waiting, wondering, and it burns them from the inside out. Why? Because the very thing they feared, intimacy, starts haunting them in reverse. Your absence creates a void, and voids don't stay empty. They fill with thoughts, with memories, with what ifs. They start to wonder where you went, why you haven't reached out, and whether someone else has taken your place. That fear they never wanted to confront, the fear of needing someone, rises like smoke from a fire they thought they put out. But it's not just fear of losing you. It's fear of losing the control they thought they had over you. You see, for an avoidant, emotional closeness triggers a loss of autonomy. But emotional abandonment, true silence, that triggers a loss of identity. And the irony is cruel, because when you were giving, they were distancing. But now that you're gone, you're the one who holds the power. With barely lifting a finger, without saying a word. That's the shift. And here's where it gets even deeper. On a psychological level, the avoidant now faces a dissonance they can't ignore. For most of their life, they told themselves that distance equals strength, that needing others is weakness, that emotions are liabilities. But your absence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like torment. Their body might be calm, but their mind becomes a battlefield. Their subconscious starts whispering truths they never wanted to hear. You pushed away someone who cared. You took their presence for granted. Now you're alone and it's your fault. That internal reckoning is brutal because it doesn't just expose their avoidance. It forces them to question their entire emotional philosophy. And while they may not admit it, they feel that loss in ways that words can't fully describe. Your absence becomes their mirror. It reflects everything they couldn't face about themselves when you were around. So don't underestimate what happens when you become unavailable. You didn't just walk away, you shifted the entire narrative. You exposed the illusion of control, you turned their emotional strategy into emotional chaos. And most importantly, you reminded them and yourself that your worth is not found in waiting for someone to choose you. It's in knowing when to choose yourself. Let them sit in that silence. Let them wrestle with the consequences of your absence. Because in the end, you didn't lose them. They lost access to a version of you they'll never experience again. There's something few people talk about when it comes to avoidance. It's the fantasy they construct around you. It's not always malicious, but it is self-serving. It's built on the belief that you'll always be there, that no matter how distant they become, no matter how many mixed signals they send or how often they vanish emotionally, you'll still be on the other end. Patient, understanding, available. This fantasy allows them to keep their armor on without ever truly losing the benefits of your connection. But the moment you stop being available, the entire illusion crumbles. This fantasy was never based on truth. It was based on their need to escape vulnerability. Avoidants often operate from a deep-rooted fear of being engulfed, of losing themselves in intimacy. So they keep emotional relationships at arm's length. But to do that, they build a convenient narrative. You'll always be there. You'll be the one to reach out. Be the one who tries again. That way, they can afford to withdraw without facing consequences. They don't have to face the discomfort of real loss because they've convinced themselves it'll never come. Now let's talk about what happens when you shatter that narrative. When you step away, not temporarily, but with presence and purpose, something breaks inside them because their whole internal system was propped up by this unspoken agreement. You won't leave, but now you have. And they weren't ready. They never imagined that you'd actually walk away and mean it, that you'd stop texting, that you'd stop trying, that you'd stop believing in their potential. And it hits them like a slow earthquake, not a sudden boom, but a gradual destabilizing shift that cracks the foundation of their emotional assumptions. Because they didn't, I just believe in the fantasy. They needed it. It was their emotional escape route, their way of maintaining superiority in the relationship while still reaping the rewards of connection. They got to be distant while you stayed loyal. They got to be vague while you remained certain. They played it safe while you put your heart on the line. But when you remove yourself from that dynamic, they're left with no one to project onto. No more comforting illusion, just reality. And it's silent, it's empty, it's not waiting for them anymore, and that's when the story they told themselves starts to turn against them. You've become bigger in your absence than you ever were in your presence. Why? Because now they're forced to see the full weight of what they dismissed. They no longer get to downplay your impact because the gap you leave behind exposes the truth. They were more attached than they admitted, more dependent than they wanted to believe. That fantasy where you were always going to chase, gone. Now they are the ones wondering, obsessing, replaying, not because you manipulated them, but because they built their identity on a foundation that no longer exists. And let's be clear, it's not just about them missing you, it's about them confronting themselves. Your absence isn't just a missing person, it's a mirror. One that reflects their own emotional immaturity. One that forces them to face how they mishandled someone who actually showed up for them. This is where your power multiplies. Not in revenge, not in games, but in the undeniable shift that happens when you stop existing in someone's life as a constant. You were their comfort, their emotional safety net. But you're no longer available to play that role. And that's when transformation begins, not just for them, but for you, because you start to see it too. You start to realize that the relationship wasn't balanced. It was built on your effort, your consistency, your hope. And now you're not part of the fantasy, you've stepped into reality. Your reality. And the most powerful part, you didn't have to slam a door or make a scene. All you had to do was disappear from the storyline they wrote without your consent. Let them revise their script. Let them sit with the silence. Because the real version of you, the one who sees through the illusion, is no longer available for their fiction. Silence. It's the one language the avoidant can't outrun. When you are speaking, explaining, expressing, trying to create emotional clarity, they could dodge, they could rationalize, they could pretend not to hear. But silence doesn't give them that luxury. Silence is clean. It's final. It doesn't beg. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't plead for understanding. And because of that, it becomes a force more powerful than any confrontation. Avoidants are masters at avoiding direct emotional engagement. That's their game. Stay distant enough to feel safe, close enough to keep the connection intact. But when you stop reaching out, when you stop checking in, when your phone goes quiet, something starts to unravel inside them. Because your silence doesn't just represent the end of communication. It represents the end of access. Access to your presence. Access to your emotional support. Access to the version of you that tried again and again. You've got to understand, be something important here. Avoidants are not immune to feelings. They're just experts at suppressing them. They've trained themselves to override emotion with logic, detachment, or distraction. But silence, that doesn't give them a path to escape. There's nothing to react to, nothing to blame, nothing to push against. They can't say you're being too emotional when you're not saying anything at all. They can't accuse you of pressure when there's no pressure being applied. And that's what drives them crazy, because now they are left with the questions. Now they are the ones checking their phone, replaying your last words, wondering why you haven't broken the silence. This is not how they imagined it would go. They assumed you'd crack, that you'd miss them first, that the need for closure or connection would pull you back in. But when that doesn't happen, they're forced to deal with a feeling they've spent their whole life avoiding: powerlessness. And here's the deeper truth. Your silence reflects their failure in a way words never could. Words can be challenged. Silence cannot. Words can be misinterpreted. Silence is absolute. It leaves space for them to feel, and what they fill it with is everything they didn't want to feel: regret, doubt, guilt, longing. The silence becomes a mirror they can't break. It shows them what their behavior truly cost them. But the most dangerous part for them is what that silence begins to suggest: that maybe, just maybe, you're no longer available, not because you're angry, but because you're done, that you've moved on, that you no longer see them as someone worth waiting on. And that idea, that thought, it cuts. Go deeper than any argument ever could. Psychologically, silence forces the avoidant to reprocess the entire relationship from a different lens. It challenges their narrative. It strips away the defense mechanisms. And for the first time, they're alone with the reality that someone they pushed away is really gone. And they don't get to be the victim in the story. They don't get to be the one who left. You did. And you didn't need a dramatic exit. You simply stopped showing up where your effort wasn't being matched. There's a philosophical weight to that silence too, because it reminds us that power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the refusal to play the same game, to engage in the same cycle, to keep proving your worth to someone who was committed to misunderstanding you. And here's what's even more profound. You're not punishing them. You're honoring yourself. You're preserving your energy. You're making a statement without uttering a single word: I've outgrown begging for bare minimum. So let them sit in the silence. Let it speak for you. Let it echo everything they refused to hear when you were still trying. Because silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the arrival of clarity. And sometimes the loudest thing you'll ever say is nothing at all. There's a moment in every dynamic with an avoidant when they realize they've miscalculated. It doesn't always happen right away. In fact, at first, they might feel relief when you pull away. They may even convince themselves that your silence proves their point, that closeness is dangerous, that people always leave, that distance is safer. But as the days stretch into silence, something shifts. And it's not about missing your presence. It's about losing the emotional leverage they never admitted they were using. Avoidants thrive in emotional ambiguity. That's their playground. When things are unclear, they feel in control. They can blame your intensity. They can gaslight your needs. They can pretend they don't care because they've trained themselves to live in a state of emotional scarcity. But when you disappear, the ambiguity ends. The game stops. They're no longer the one choosing distance. You've already created it. And that's where their entire emotional framework starts to collapse. The thing is, many avoidants believe their detachment protects them. They think if they can just stay disconnected enough, they'll never be hurt. But what they fail to realize is that detachment doesn't equal immunity. It only delays the confrontation. And when someone they secretly depended on suddenly becomes unavailable, that detachment flips into something else entirely. Regret, uncertainty, even obsession. Here's the psychological trap they fall into. They equate control with security. As long as they were pulling back and you were pursuing, they felt stable. But once you no longer respond, once you're not trying to fix or understand them, their illusion of control vanishes. Suddenly, they're not running the show anymore. You are. And not by force, but by your absence. That's when the real fear kicks in. Not fear of you, but fear of the truth. They lost someone who was actually real with them. You see, avoidance isn't a lack of feelings. It's a fear of those feelings being too overwhelming, too consuming, too risky. So when someone shows up consistently, genuinely, and vulnerably, they don't know how to handle it. They pull back. thinking it's safer. But when you remove yourself, you give them exactly what they claim they wanted, space. And in that space, they don't find peace. They find the consequences of their avoidance. This is where many people get confused. They assume the avoidant doesn't care, that silence means indifference. But in reality, silence is where avoidants often confront their deepest emotions. Because there's no distraction left. There's no validation, no effort from you to push against, just stillness. And in that stillness, they have to deal with the uncomfortable truth that someone who once made them feel wanted, seen, and secure is gone. Not mad, not chasing, just gone. And the mind doesn't know how to sit with that, especially a mind trained in self-protection. So what does it do? It replays, it analyzes, it remembers. It starts to romanticize what it once rejected. And eventually it realizes something profound. You weren't the threat, you were the exception. But now they're left with a memory, not a presence. An echo, not a voice. And here's the paradox. Their need to avoid vulnerability pushed away the one person who handled their vulnerability with care. That realization hits hard. And there's no quick fix for it. There's no text long enough to repair what consistent distance destroyed. Because now you've become something they can no longer access, and that's what makes them feel it. This is why your silence is more than space. It's transformation. Not just for them, but for you. Because when you stop showing up for someone who couldn't meet you, you don't just reclaim your power, you elevate your standard. You show yourself that love is not meant to be begged for, it's meant to be reciprocated. So let them reflect. Let them sit in the stillness they once chose. Because the greatest lesson an avoidant can learn is this. When you play with distance, don't be surprised when the connection doesn't wait for you. And the greatest lesson for you, don't chase clarity where silence already gave you the answer. One of the most unexpected effects of your absence is that it forces the avoidant to do something they've spent their entire life resisting. Feel, truly feel, not distract, not intellectualize, not escape into busyness or false detachment, but actually sit in the discomfort of emotions they can't control, can't predict, and can't run from. This is where things get real. Because when you were present, they had somewhere to project their tension, their inner conflict, their unresolved wounds, but now you're no longer a buffer, and their inner world starts to surface raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. Avoidants often live in emotional suppression. It's their survival mechanism. Maybe they grew up in homes where emotional expression was punished, or maybe they were shamed for having needs. So they built a belief system. Vulnerability equals danger. Closeness equals loss of identity. Intimacy equals suffocation. So they disconnect, they build emotional walls, they create just enough distance to feel safe, but not enough to be alone. That's the contradiction that defines them. But when you're no longer available, they no longer get to hold that middle ground. The illusion of safety dissolves, and all those buried emotions, they start crawling to the surface. Guilt, sadness, confusion, even longing. The very feelings they swore they didn't have, it's not that they suddenly changed, it's that your silence took away their ability to avoid. What's truly fascinating here is that most avoidants don't even recognize their emotional shutdown while it's happening. They think they're being logical. They'll say, I just need space, or I don't want to hurt you, or I'm not ready for anything serious. But those aren't boundaries. They're deflections. They're shields used to mask deeper fears. Fears they've never confronted because no one ever forced them to. But when someone like you, someone present, emotionally intelligent, invested, removes yourself from the equation, they're finally alone with the silence of their own emotional world. And that silence becomes deafening. That's where the emotional unraveling begins. It doesn't always happen dramatically. Sometimes it's subtle. They find themselves thinking about you at random times. They remember things you said, how you showed up, how you stayed. They begin to realize that your presence wasn't pressure, it was stability. You weren't invading their space, you were offering depth. And the absence of that depth starts to sting in ways they never imagined, not because they didn't care before, but because they never learned how to process what care actually feels like. This is what makes your absence so transformative. It doesn't just break the pattern, it exposes it. It highlights the parts of themselves they've neglected, denied, and dismissed. And no, they may not tell you this. Most avoidants won't. They'll sit with the feelings, quietly unraveling, trying to make sense of the internal shift that's now happening without your input, because for once, the spotlight isn't on your emotional needs, it's on theirs. And they don't know how to meet them. But here's the crucial part for you. You are not responsible for their emotional awakening. Your job was never to heal them. Your presence may have sparked their awareness, but it's their responsibility to grow from it. Your absence creates the conditions, but the transformation, that's on them. Always. That's why you don't return just because they reach out. That's why you don't water down your silence the moment they feel discomfort. You have to understand the weight of the work your absence is doing. It's not about making them issue. It's about giving them the space to finally confront the emotional desert they've been living in. And whether they cross that desert or stay stuck in it, that's their path. So don't underestimate the impact of stepping away. The emotional unraveling it causes in them is not a punishment, it's a mirror. And in that mirror, they finally see what they've been avoiding all along, themselves. And maybe, just maybe, they'll realize that the real danger wasn't intimacy, it was losing someone who gave it so freely. So leave them with the silence and walk away knowing this. You didn't leave to teach them a lesson, you left because you finally learned yours. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in any relationship with an avoidant is the power of self-respect. Most people focus on tactics, when to text, how to say things, what not to do. But those are surface level moves. The real shift, the irreversible transformation happens when you stop responding from a place of fear and start acting from a place of value. The value begins with one decision. I will no longer abandon myself to be chosen by someone else. That's when everything changes, not because they suddenly get it, but because you do. You stop needing closure from someone who is never open. You stop over-explaining yourself to someone who is never listening. You stop proving your worth to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. That's not cold, that's clarity. That's the moment you realize that love without reciprocity isn't love, it's sacrifice. And real love doesn't ask you to sacrifice your identity. When you're no longer available to an avoidant, it sends a message, not to them, but to yourself. It says, I know what I bring. I know what I deserve. I know that connection is not meant to feel like starvation. And once you anchor into that level of self-respect, your energy shifts. You're no longer playing defense, trying to avoid being abandoned. You're playing offense, building a life where your peace is not negotiable. See, avoidants depend on you not knowing your worth. That's the unsaid foundation of the entire dynamic. They pull back and you lean in. They get cold and you get warmer. They create chaos and you create understanding. Why? Because deep down you've been taught that love is something to earn. But the moment you realize that love is something to receive, your entire emotional compass recalibrates. You stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop shrinking yourself to fit their emotional limitations. And here's what's fascinating. When you shift, they feel it. It's not about posting more. It's not about proving you've moved on. It's the stillness in your energy, the lack of anxiety in your silence, the absence of neediness in your distance. It's when they can no longer feel your emotional tether. And for the first time, they're the ones in emotional limbo. Not because you played a game, but because you finally stopped playing one. Avoidants often operate on a subconscious level. They don't sit around plotting how to manipulate you. They're acting out old survival patterns, scripts they've never rewritten. But when you remove yourself from the equation, you become the interruption to that script. You're the plot twist they didn't anticipate because they expected you to orbit them. They expected you to stay available. They expected you to keep proving. But instead, you evolved quietly, powerfully, without warning. And maybe they'll come back. Maybe they'll reach out. Maybe they'll try to re-enter. But by the time they do, something fundamental has changed. You've tasted your own peace. You've seen your own strength. And once you've lived in that place, you don't give it up easily. Because now you understand that your emotional availability is a privilege, not a punishment. And only those who meet you with depth, presence, and consistency get access to it. This is where empowerment is born. Not in cutting people off out of anger, but in walking away with grace. In choosing solitude over confusion. In valuing your inner world more than their mixed signals. That's when you stop being reactive and start being intentional. That's when you stop waiting for them to wake up and start awakening to yourself. So if they come back, fine. If they don't, also fine, because your peace no longer hinges on their presence. You've built something more solid, a self that no longer begs for love it already deserves. And that's the real shift. When being unavailable to the avoidant no longer feels like a loss, but like coming home to yourself